First of all, let me give Jiwoo a chance to give us his thoughts about the subject as well as his initial reactions to the presentation that we have already seen. Dr. Luo Zhigong, I'm not so sure what his latest situation is. As Jiwoo introduced earlier on, he has been dragged down by these slow motion problems in the Legislative Council in Hong Kong, and initially he thought he could come, but we're not so sure. But if he could come, he could join us anytime. Jiwoo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Casey. Let me also first really thank the great team from the Paris School of Economics. Before I also forget again, I'm really grateful for the AGI organizers for this event, Severin, Asin, and also Kelly Yuan. So Severin is our managing editor for the Asia Global Online, and she has been doing all the lifting, preparation, and so on, making this event happen. As you can see, the World Inequality Report has many different chapters and perspectives, especially reflecting on the huge database collected and maintained by more than 100 researchers. So there are many, many things, many takeaways we can talk about. But let me spend a few minutes, just give my take on a few points. Obviously, I cannot go through too many of the different aspects and so on. So first, I understand that usually because of data concerns and many other limitations, we are more focused on income inequality and wealth inequality. For many years, I thought the more relevant, relatively more relevant, important inequality for policymakers and policy thinkers to focus on is consumption inequality. Because the three types of inequality clearly have different trajectories over time in any given country. Typically, as you can imagine, wealth inequality should be much more severe than income inequality, which is in turn much more severe, more widely dispersed than consumption inequality. If you're like me, who likes to think about long-term historical evolutions, if you actually go back to hunting-gathering days for humanity, in those days, wealth inequality, income inequality, and consumption inequality were more or less the same thing, because income was wealth, wealth was income, income was consumption, and not much ability to really store things. But as humanity has been making more and more progress, the three distributions across different segments of society have become further and further separated from each other. So I think for policymakers, especially I guess in countries like France and so on, right, the consumption distribution is really what matters, so that we really want to make sure as humans no one is really left behind suffering from hunger and so on. But as long as there is some minimum standard, even for the people at the very bottom, to live on, then there is no more need for government agencies to use their power to force the wealth distribution or the income distribution to be flatter than what we see. Because I'm also more concerned about the incentive implications for creative innovations and so on, if we really go very, very harsh on the top wealth and income earners. So I think that maybe the consumption inequality data should also be, or maybe even more importantly, to be focused, to be collected and analyzed by us researchers and scholars. And then my second point is, actually it's very interesting when Yang Li showed us in one of his charts the ratio between wealth and income in China. As you may recall, back in 1978 when the reforms started, the wealth to income ratio for China was something like 350%, so 3.5 times. And then 2 years ago, in 2015, it really rose to 7 times. So it's a very remarkable achievement. But as a financial economist, I would like to say that much of that is because of capitalization and financialization progress by China. Because what is the stock market price? The stock market price for Tencent does not reflect its past earnings, but it reflects the discounted value of the infinitely many future years of income. Whereas back in 1978, there was no stock market for Chinese businesses to really rely on to have their future income projections priced in today's terms. So much of the financial wealth today in China is really a result of the availability of so many capitalization instruments and markets and so on. So I would say, this increase in this ratio is something to be celebrated, but for a somewhat different reason than you might think. So that's my second comment. My third comment is, as much as we would like to hate or criticize capitalism, we should not forget that policy actions by government agencies and regulators are implicitly responsible for a lot of the rising inequality. Without being too abstract, let me give a quick example. Right? You all, as I said, I'm a financial economist, so I like to use the stock market as an example. In China, some of my colleagues would like to call the bubble that is going on, whether in the real estate market or in the stock market in China. Those bubbles are all regulated bubbles, or managed bubbles, or guaranteed bubbles. What that means is all the different government agencies try very hard to make sure that the bubble will not grow too fast, but they want it to grow. And also, if there's any default by borrowers, then someone has to come in to pay the creditors, the lenders. So that's called 刚性兑付, forced or rigid or guaranteed payment. So all such efforts, right, serve to transfer income and wealth from those who don't have financial investments or real estate investments to those who do have financial investments and real estate investments. Because when you don't let the bubble burst in any way, right, who benefits, who pays, who sacrifices? Well, those who have financial investments, have many housing apartments and so on, they are helped. But through the government power to transfer public or state wealth and state fiscal income directly and indirectly, especially through the value realized out of land sales to pay off those lenders, investors in the stock market or in the bond market and so on. So you all got my point. So a lot of the times when we discuss financial policies, we don't think that monetary policies and financial policies, whatever they do, have implications for the income distribution, wealth distribution, and so on. All such actions do have implications for all those distributions, even though we stay focused. Okay, so if the central bank in China raises or lowers interest rates, wow, the stock market will go this way and the economy will go that way. And then we don't pay attention to implications of such policy actions. for the income and wealth distributions. So this is why, as researchers, we should not just blame everything on the private entrepreneurs who keep making more and more money, but also we need to pay attention to what the policymakers have done in contributing to the rise in income inequality. And then let me use my fourth comment closer to talk something much closer to Hong Kong. Because a few days ago, I was at this car dealership just to disclose to buy a Mercedes car. Then I did not realize, a whole car dealer industry in Hong Kong is so preserved, so monopolized, right? Because, my wife was so upset that the car dealer would not be willing to give any concession to the price or anything else. Even after I expressed a signal so clearly that today I would like to buy a car from you. And the guy just did not show any interest trying to retain me as the customer, because we lived in the US for something like 31 years. So we were so spoiled by this tough competition among car dealers, but not in Hong Kong. So every day for me living here in Hong Kong is a new learning experience. So what I'm trying to say is that, so those lucrative, profitable opportunities are really reserved for those monopolists. And later I learned that this car dealer company is actually owned by Jardine Matheson, right? So those easy to print or make money businesses are still monopolized by the colonial legacies, right? And then the people at the bottom in Hong Kong have to compete so hard for much less profitable opportunities like restaurants and grocery stores and so on. So now you see why this a pre-existing setup in Hong Kong and also the rigid social structure in this society have made it so hard actually for the people from the lower segments to really move up. As much as I would like to be critical of the rising inequalities in China, I would like to say Hong Kong has rising inequality, but for a very different reason. I mean, the mainland for that part is much more competitive. Many more industries are not so locked up for the very privileged few, although there may be, that may be the case for the banking industry and so on. So this is why.
Before you continue, let me just make an advertisement.
Correct.
I'm a member of the Competition Commission of Hong Kong.
Okay.
I'm also
go
the
after them.
I'm also the chairman of its enforcement committee. If you have the evidence, you can always make a complaint. We'll look into it.
Okay, I'll give you more details on my experience last Saturday. Okay, so I was complaining to Yvonne, our operations director at AGI, because I always view her as a representative of the status quo in Hong Kong. But my last comment is on the voucher reform or shock therapy reform approach in Russia versus the gradualist reform approach in China. Yang Li, I know you guys would like to attribute everything that has gone wrong in Russia to the shock therapy approach. I take a somewhat different view on this because I actually have studied and used many of the privatization cases out of Russia, including Gazprom, and also this candy company, Red October. So many of you may not know what that means. It's not that the revolution, it's all the different candies sold in Russia under the brand name Red October. From my understanding, it's not so much the voucher scheme, but rather the non-privatized remaining shares after 1990. So in the case of Gazprom and also Red October, something like 40% of the ownership shares were state-owned even after the voucher program was done. But then those still largely SOEs ran into a lot of financial problems. Then they were forced to actually sell much of the remaining shares in order to still keep those firms alive. And then you all know the business, the oligarchs were very closely connected to the top politicians, so they worked out schemes to sell much of the remaining state-owned shares, which contributed to a few of the top oligarchs making much more wealth and more income and so on. So, but on the other hand, I do realize that some of the vouchers distributed to average citizens in Russia, they did not know what to make of those vouchers. So they just sold those vouchers very cheaply. I mean, I personally did that too. I mean, China never distributed any vouchers. I wish that China could do this. But as someone who had no idea about bonds, when I started working, getting a monthly paycheck, payment, salary in China in 1986. So because in those days, each monthly salary was about 80% paid in cash, 20% in government bonds. So whoever happened to be standing next to me at the moment I received those government bonds, I would just give to that person all those bonds for free. Because I thought, oh, those are just useless paper, right? So I think given my experience, at that time I already had a master's degree. I could not assign any value to such bonds. So I imagine many people in Russia, when they received those vouchers. But on the other hand, I have to say, of course, many people say those vouchers were used to buy a vodka and so on. But I wish people in China had such an opportunity to use vouchers to buy baijiu. Because at least that was, anyway, that was one right given to them. Whatever you want to use those vouchers for, so that it's your choice. But that's in a normative sense, right? That's a more equalizing approach than just letting the few elite people take over the SOEs in China. Anyway, I've spent more than 10 minutes on this. Sorry. So these are my quick comments.
Thank you, Jiwoo. Well, we still have half an hour for our discussions. Before we open the floor for questions, I just want to highlight a few, because we have seen a lot of numbers, but I think there are many factors of many issues that are the driving forces of these changes in the numbers. Well, I'm an economist by background, so I highlight some of these economic issues, because at the end of the day, if we want to address this inequality, inequality could be very damaging. Well, of course, in the short term, we all feel, well, it is fair. And then in the longer term, I mean, if wealth continues to concentrate in a small percentage of the population, then it undermines, because you will have, generations after generations inheriting huge amounts of wealth. And this could even undermine the very fundamental values of our open society, of capitalism, of fairness, meritocracy. You have so many people who are born, with a gold spoon in their mouth. And I think it undermines social and political, basic values. So it's a very serious subject. But at the same time, we must deal with this issue very carefully, because as you could see, I take this chart from the report. This is the breakdown of global income in 1990 by the major countries in 1990. And then you will see a different chart in the year 2016. This is 1990, this is 2016. To cut the long story short, actually it was illustrated through the elephant curve. We have seen well, income disparity rising in almost every country, any country we go into. But you look at the world as a whole, let's not forget that from 1980 up till now, in the last 3 to 4 decades, we have seen a huge improvement in the livelihood of many poor people in the world. Billions of people got out of poverty. So if you look at the general trend, it is all this market liberalization, market freedom, all these global, globalization trends that led to very significant improvements in the livelihood of billions of people in the developing countries. You look at major organizations like IMF, World Bank, and so on, they all say that one thing they are all worried today is low productivity growth in the developed countries, or perhaps also globally. You look at their policy prescriptions, typically they will say that, well, it's important that countries, particularly in the developing countries, improve their economic efficiency, push forward continued productivity growth, because that is the fundamental force that will ensure that you will have continuing resources to improve the livelihood of millions and millions of people. And yet, we are encountering a situation where income disparity, wealth disparity, increasingly asks for more government intervention, the visible hand. Well, we have been educated most of the time today that France is the country we should learn from. So it's just a joke. Huh? I don't. But I think that is an important concept that between globalization, free markets, free market capitalism, and more government intervention. I think there is a balance somewhere in there. I just want to, well, as we want to leave more time for questions, so could we ask for your very short comment on this balance between free market capitalism and more government intervention to address income inequality? Governments are all talking about that anyway in recent years. And I've seen actually some stabilization in the situation in the last 5-7 years. So what have your studies have shown, and what are your views on this?
Thank you very much for the comments and a lot of food for thought as well. So regarding the evolution of global inequality, I think that the first point to make is pretty important, is that we hear a lot in public discourse, also in a lot of academic discourse, that okay, there's a rise in inequality within countries, after the second wave of globalization starting in the 1980s, but there is very high income growth at the bottom of the distribution, and that this leads to a reduction of global inequality. And what we document in the report is that the reduction in global inequality is only between countries. So that's the rise of China effect. But the reduction of global inequality is not between world individuals. This one rises. It rises very much. Now, it is true that there is high income growth at the bottom of the distribution. So that's what we show in the elephant curve, 100% growth at the bottom of the global distribution. But our basic point, the basic point we make in the report, is we could actually have done much better at the bottom had growth been better distributed within each country. That's the basic point we make, actually. So now, how do you better distribute growth within each country without damaging growth? That's the key question. And we answer this by comparing China and India, for instance, or Europe versus the USA. And we show that you can actually have relatively high growth that is much better distributed. You don't need to have high inequality to trigger high growth at the bottom. And again, the US is the extreme counter-argument to the trickle-down effect. And in relation to your question, so what's the balance between government intervention and deregulation? It is a fact that we observe much more deregulation, much higher reduction in tax progressivity, much more disengagement of public actors from university, from health, from infrastructure investment in the USA than in Europe. So that's one way to answer the question. The European model, and France is clearly not the perfect example, and Europe also has a lot to learn from the rest of the world. But when we compare Europe with the USA, we see that the cursor was not put too much towards forces of free markets, of deregulation of the past 8 years. There was an ability to retain some power from collective, from public actors to actually counter this rise of inequality that you observe in the US, in Anglo-Saxon countries, which were more into the cursor of the free market economy with less regulation. Just one point on the consumption point that was made at the beginning, which is extremely important indeed. Consumption is essential to an essential metric to measure in economics. That said, I have a different opinion with respect to where we come from. We actually come from a world of international official institutions that essentially measure consumption and only consumption. If you look at what the World Bank does, what the United Nations does, if you look at all inequality databases that can be available online, it's all about consumption. And this is a main limitation. And this is why we come in with this project, where you need also to measure income, because inequality is basically how you distribute GDP growth. You want to know how GDP growth is distributed. If you only look at consumption, you also miss an important part of the question, which is what do very rich individuals do with their savings, and with, you know, sometimes for top incomes, the frontier between consumption and income is pretty blurred, you know? And so when you have a very high income, what do you do when you buy a foundation, when you buy a newspaper? Is it consumption of media space or political space? And this makes me think of recent political events in the US, for instance. If we only look at the consumption of Donald Trump, well, you don't see the kind of level of inequality that you would have for income. And of course, if you're also interested in wealth inequality, of course, you need income and consumption. So basically, we're also in the process of going there in the database. In the USA, we have consumption, we have income, and basically our general conclusion are unchanged. If you look at disposable cash income in the US for the bottom 50%, very close to consumption, it's stable over the past 40 years. So this is just reinforces our general conclusions that we have exposed here when we look at income.
Okay.
Before we started to give the floor to the audience, can I address Professor Chen's second comments and the third comments with numbers? But I need to use my slides. Okay. Is that okay?
Just a very quick comment.
Yeah. It's very quick.
Okay.
Yeah. So Professor Chen's second comments was about the rise of the national wealth income ratio in China, and how much percentage of it is caused by the bubbles. Here we actually did the decomposition, and I will explain this table clearly and little by little to you. And it's actually a very important table, but I didn't put it inside because I was worried about I don't have enough time. So the bottom row is the national wealth income ratio. As you can see, in 1996, we only did it from 1996 to 2015. In 1996, it's 479%. 2015 is 710%. And the increase of the wealth can caused by three effects. First is initial wealth effect, and then is the saving. You save money, you get more wealth. And the third is, we call it the price effect. That is the capital gain and also the bubbles. So among this 710% wealth income ratio in 2015, we have 93 initial effect. About 300% is because of saving, and 320%, half of them almost, is because of the price effect. All right? And then in public, we also can divide them into the public wealth and the private wealth. This is getting even more interesting, because if we look at private wealth, non-financial assets, in 2015, it's 300%. And among these 300%, there are only 31% from the initial effect, wealth effect, and 36% from saving, and 230% are from the price effect. What does that mean? That means the housing price is going up, and the private sector benefit a lot from this housing, the growth of the housing price. And on the other side, the net financial assets in 2015 is 190, 16% from the initial wealth effect, and 170% from the saving, and 1% from the price effect. What does that mean? The Chinese people like saving money. They put a lot of money into the bank. However, if you do so, you're the loser in the last 20 years because you don't make more money by just saving it. Okay, I'll stop here to save some time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's not that easy to actually single out how much contribution, capitalization, and financialization have made to the 710% wealth to GDP ratio. Because you can use savings as something not related to capitalization, but in fact, it is related. So the household income itself, even before you get to the wealth, what people get today from company paychecks and so on, part of that is related to the capitalization, especially for the top wealth holders, right? Much of their income is not from wages or salaries, rather from the capital gains related to the company's shares and so on. So in that case, what they save out of their income is already partly due to the capitalization, which made the increase in income really possible. So then it becomes a fixed point theorem issue, right? How do you single out the marginal contribution due to the increasing roles played by the stock markets in China and outside China and other financial markets? It's very difficult to really do the separation. You can only do what we economists call a partial equilibrium separation. But all together, they're really enhancing each other. Anyway, I'm sounding too technical.
Yeah, I think we could list the technical and academic arguments later on. Actually, I have two more issues before I want to open this up. Well, first of all, I just want to highlight one very basic fundamental issue, which is the continued development of an economy. This chart actually shows, well, the green line shows the people who are, primary school graduate, lower secondary school graduates. The horizontal axis is the age of working experience. The blue line are the university graduates. Their salaries are much higher. They grow much faster. The level of, the kind of jobs they enter into are very different. They have much more bigger variations. And indeed, if you look at the distribution, the variance of income of the lower segments, more basic jobs, the cleaners and so forth, the variance is very small. But if you look at the university graduates, the more complicated jobs, the variance is very big. And furthermore, if you look at a lot of industrial developed economies, the center of gravity of the population distribution, the workforce distribution, is aging. So they're moving right. And many more of them are better and better educated. And the modern economy will also have more and more jobs that belong to the university graduates. So as the whole population or the whole workforce gradually move from the bottom left to the top right, you inevitably have more and more jobs that will have very big variations in the income distribution. So in a way, what I'm trying to say is, as economies develop, it is quite easy for income distribution to become more and more varied. Of course, governments could intervene. What I'm trying to say is, well, first of all, you have this very fundamental economic force lurking behind all these numbers. And secondly, which is also a very important subject, is income mobility. First of all, well, governments want to educate the population more and more, and then the public will also ask, okay, if I have the fair opportunity to become rich, so I don't need to have a red eye towards those very rich. One day I could be very rich. And well, first of all, there are two issues. First of all, do we have more adequate policies to ensure that everybody gets this opportunity to move ahead? And secondly, do we believe societies are concerned about the lack of income mobility? We are talking about the top 10%, top 1%. But increasingly, we are finding that the top 1% in the US are people like, Microsoft, Bill Gates, and Amazon, and Google. In China, it's Tencent, Pony Ma, and Ma Yun of Alibaba. And these people actually replace the old generation of 1%, 10%, which typically would rely on very traditional forces, traditional power. And globally, the people from China, from India, from other parts of Asia are replacing the oil kings and princes. They are replacing the General Motors of the world. They're replacing all these old industries. So we have rapid changes in this top 10% and top 1%, as well as in the middle class, as well as in the lower classes. So I just want to open this. I don't have any conclusion. What I'm trying to say is, behind all these disparity figures, there may be a lot of changes going on underneath. So I just want to see what your reaction is.
Regarding education versus technology and this race between education and technology, which triggers this dispersion of wages within and between firms. This is an important part of the story. I completely agree with you. So, of course, governments need to provide, education, investments in line with the evolution of, technology and general development of the country. And this can help solve the inequality problem at the bottom. Now, I think there's another issue which should not be overlooked, which is inequality at the very top, which is completely disconnected from education. When you look at CEO wage in the US or in Germany, for the top firms, for instance, which are not less productive in Germany, they have no less markets. They are they have similar levels of market capitalization. CEO wage are much lower in Germany for the same kind of job than in the US. And this is not related to skills or to education. So there's no connection between the wage and basically, in fact, the productivity of these CEOs. So at the very top, I think it's another issue, which cannot be dealt with more education, which should be dealt with other measures. So I think we need to distinguish bottom and top inequality here. Now, with respect to your second point, which was
mobility.
Yeah, mobility. In the USA, we have precise data on mobility, and we discussed this in the final part of the report, where we show an extremely strong correlation between parental income and probability to access to higher education in the US. So basically, conclusion, there is no mobility in the USA higher education system because there is such a tight connection between parental income and children's ability to access to college. We have much less data on this in other countries, and we need to access this data. We also need a data revolution in terms of access to education, to be better able to assess these dynamics in other countries, but in the USA in particular, we don't really see a transformation of the social structure of the top 10% of the previous decades, because we rather see a reproduction of past inequality. So this is fascinating work by Raj Sethi and Emmanuel Saez in the USA. The article is called "Is the US a Land of Opportunity?" And all those interested, I really recommend. This is a very fantastic read.
Actually, on this point, it's very interesting. We have a good panel here with somewhat different assessments or opinions. I agree that if you use data from any country, social mobility is not absolutely liquid. So you will see a lot of legacy-based continuation, whether, especially in Hong Kong, who are the elite business families. You don't see many new faces. Even if you look at all the corporate brands and names in Central, most of them are from a century ago, right? So that is problematic. But on the other hand, I think in relative terms, we almost always have to focus on the relative differences. I understand that there is absolutely, in the absolute sense, there is not as much mobility as we would like in the U.S. and in other countries. But if we just anecdotally pay attention to who are the new billionaires, as Casey mentioned, right? Bill Gates did not come out of a rich family in the U.S. And then if you look at all the other ones, eBay, Google, and so on, many of them were first-generation immigrants from other countries, although Trump would like to block that. And then if you look at China, so my point is inequality rising for different reasons in different countries. In cases like Russia and China, for the most part, up to this point, the political connections and such factors have played a much bigger role in creating the new billionaires and the new top 1% and so on. Whereas in the US, yes, there are many legacy-based rich families like the Rockefellers and Fords and even Trump himself, right? But at the same time, there are many more others that are new money. So I think if it is just a meritocracy-based mobility, then even if the wealth and income distribution get even more extreme, that's still more acceptable than income distribution or inequality that's totally caused because you're the children of a powerful family. So I have a much bigger problem for this type of inequality increase, not based on merits and own work or creativity, but based on family background. Anyway, you all got my point. So.
This is a specialist doctor in eye surgery. He built up a clinic. He employed a lot of doctors to help him. He expanded his clinics into China. And then he put his firm public. He became a multi-billionaire. Well, what I'm trying to say is, in the modern economy, in the new services economy, in the new intangible economy, when people invest in brands, people invest in networks, people invest in platforms and building on the capability of new IT and all these new technologies and Facebooks and so on. The way to make money could be very different. Well, anyway, I don't want to spend too much time giving him too much advertising. I think we have highlighted some of the issues behind those numbers. One could draw his or her own conclusions. But I think it's time for us to open the floor to any questions you want to address. Can I have the gentleman that one? No. Next.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. For Dr. Chancel and Dr. Jiang, I have a question. Inequality is closely associated to a concept and a fact, a social fact that is the informal economy. I would like to know how the informal economy is impacting the output of your conclusions. And I think it's important because the informal economy in China represents a large portion of domestic output, consumption and employment. And those are the measures, the units of measures that you was mentioning, Dr. Chancel. Thank you.
So I will let Yang Li answer in the case of China, but this is a general issue that we have to deal with, especially for emerging countries, Brazil or India, for instance. And this is where actually the surveys are important, because the tax data covers the formal economy by definition, and misses informal economy at the top, because evasion, tax fraud also very much happens in terms of number, essentially at the top. And this is also one kind of informal economy that we try to better take into account, thanks also to the work of Gabriel Zuckman with tax evasion and tax havens. And so we use, for instance, data from leaks, the HSBC leaks, the recent leaks, and that we combine with, in the countries where we can, we combine this with tax data in order to better take evasion at the top. Now for the bottom, surveys are very useful there, because you have, in many cases, in many countries, information on who is working in what kind of sector. And so, as a general rule, we include income levels at the bottom of distribution from people living in the informal sector. And now, perhaps you want to add for the specific case of China.
For the Chinese case, in short, yes, we covered it. And more words on it, it's in the survey data, they covered, for example, the income of the farmers and self-employed these individuals. And the tax data also, they should cover, they don't cover the farmers, but they should cover the self-employed individuals. So we consider this in our research already. Thanks.
Thank you. The comparison between US and Europe is a powerful one. But the pattern, to some extent, is not that surprising. If we look at the literature of varieties of capitalism between liberal market economy, epitomized by the US, versus coordinated market economy, epitomized, represented by Germany. Now, as you know, institutions and facts are the explanation. And these economies are governed by a different set of interdependent, interlocking, mutually reinforcing institutions. So even if, by some miracle, US want to vote to become more like Germany tomorrow, it's not so easy. It's not so easy to imitate Germany and other countries, although they are good examples. Now, these different economies, they have strengths and weaknesses. So Germany is a more equal economy than the US, right? So in the market economy is more equal. And they're both innovative in different ways. The theory says that the liberal market economy represented by the US is better at radical innovations, whereas Europe or Germany is better at incremental innovations. Now, in fact, there's a lot of studies done in Europe about how to be more innovative. And Europe would like to be more like the US, to be more innovative. So to some extent, we have a dilemma. Yes, if we somehow become more like Germany and other countries, the society will become more equal. Okay, but that, in theory, it works. But in reality, it's hard to do. But the challenge is, can we or do we want to be more like Germany? At the cost of not being as able to be more radically innovative, like the US, which is needed in this era of rapid technological changes.
What was the power of innovation over the past 40 years for the bottom 50% of the American population, which did not see which didn't see any point of additional growth? So the question is also how can the US develop an innovation model, perhaps with a bit less innovation, but that is more able to generate to the masses, basically. Otherwise, as was said before, this can lead to all sorts of political, economic, environmental disasters, which perhaps is also what we are already seeing in the US. So, of course, there needs to be a fine-tuning between state regulation and market forces. But it seems to me that the US really have a question here as to how this innovation model can benefit to the bottom of the distribution, which has not been the case of the previous decades. So really, what did this innovation you know, what was its real impact on the bottom 50% of the population? It's hard to say at the moment, but I agree it's a fascinating topic. Yeah.
I also think the question is very interesting. To answer, do we want to become Germany? Maybe no. Or do we want to become America? Maybe no. But I also answer a question with another question. Is it possible to have a very high economic growth with also low inequality? We don't know. You cannot answer me, say it's totally impossible. That's why we're doing our research to compare countries with countries. China is a very good example, actually, I think. And then find the middle way to have lower inequality, high economic growth. Why can't? Thank you.
Well, we still have. Sorry.
Just a quick, somewhat different take on this. So I think if we look at how the capital markets have helped the U.S. To take the innovation center from the UK and continental Europe to the US, starting from the early 19th century. So I cannot think of anything else as important as the capital markets being the driver of creative innovations, in the sense that the stock market allows you to price the future. So early on, when you are even 20 years or 20-some years old, even in high school, you know you are a billionaire. So that kind of incentivizing role model for the larger population is very, very effective. So many people wonder why American kids in kindergarten talk about Bill Gates and others being their role models. So that has made the American cultural DNA somehow consistent of a lot of those energy and desires to be the next innovator. So I think if I look around, because I was in Germany several months ago talking to some of the top German economists, they were wondering the same question too. How come we don't have any companies like Amazon or Google or Tencent, Alibaba? That made me think, wow, actually, there are only two countries in that sense that are very similar, China and the US. You wonder why China is now, more, in that sense, more like the US. It's really the capital markets that have done the magic. I was talking to this senior friend, senior journalist friend of mine of the Financial Times 2 weeks ago, and we were wondering, so why the private equity venture capital players in China and in Hong Kong now are so connected to the U.S. Community, the American community of private equity and venture capitalists. I mean, they can speak the same language. They all are interested in the same thing. That is, which company, which idea has the greatest future income and revenue growth potential. They want to invest in those firms. Whereas when you go to Europe, not that, well, Europeans have a good life. I mean, and also one other thing I want to mention is, let's not too focused on wealth and income, because at the end of the day, right, for Americans, even for the people at relatively the low segments of the population in the income distribution, they have a very comfortable life. So we're not talking about people dying of hunger and suffering from the cold like we do now here in Hong Kong. Then, when the basic things are taken care of, so all the other extra things, you can have or not have. But I know there are some people who for various reasons, don't have enough to eat. But there are many organizations, such as the church and so on in the U.S., providing a lot of help in addition to government welfare programs.
Well, I think we could continue to debate this. We should have ended this session a minute ago, but I think I still see a lot of hands. Let me exercise my discretion. Can we have one more question from the gentleman at the front, our Council Honorary General of France, and the lady at the back? And then could you put your questions first,
Yes,
And then we'll
thank you. My question was, obviously the inequality is increasing in the world. My question is how is it felt by population? And regarding what you had just said, Professor Joe, I think we have countries like US, UK, perhaps also Germany, where the fact to be rich and is very considered because you have blessed by God somewhere. And other countries like France and Latin countries, Catholic countries, where the fact to be rich is probably that you have stolen money to somebody, so that you are. So that means that we don't tolerate inequality in countries like France, and you can tolerate more in US perhaps for the reason that Professor Gio has just said. So do you think that this level of inequality might become unbearable in the world, or I don't know what the situation in China, so it's interesting, or is it something which is normal, providing the 50% below get some more wealth?
Can we also have the question at the back before we wrap up?
Thank you. Linda Chilanli from City University of Hong Kong. Thanks, first of all, thanks the speakers for a very excellent project, okay, completely very excellent project. I think it's very timely, and also thank you for sharing the information on the platform as well. Two questions, very simple. Firstly, we are interested, obviously, of course, first of all, in Hong Kong, right? Because we are now in Hong Kong, but I just discovered we cannot find much data on inequality on the platform. So I don't know whether you have some difficulty in accessing our data, or, you know, or maybe, or any other difficulties with other countries or jurisdictions. Okay, so a point about data access and other things. Secondly, I think what Dr. Kwok Casey, mentioned about productivity, that point, I would like to address a little bit, because when we talk about inequality, I think many of us here would share that we have to work more on reducing inequality. But I think a lot of us, and actually all of us, are also concerned about the impact on productivity. That is a classical question, right? So, well, we haven't heard actually much about, your observations, and there's a lot of data on that part as well. So maybe you can comment on that.
Thank you very much for the three questions. So first of all, on relationship to inequality and inequality aversion. Indeed, it depends on countries. We think at the World Inequality Lab that rising inequality is indeed not uncorrelated to political events like the Brexit or like the election of Donald Trump. Indeed, in the USA, there's this stagnation of the bottom 50%. Nobel Prize Angus Deaton recently wrote a piece in the New York Times warning the American population that they should not overlook the deep poverty problem. So you have 10 million Americans at the very bottom of distribution where life expectancy rates are actually lower than in countries like Vietnam. So there is a deep poverty problem in such a country, which can indeed be linked to election of different types of populists. And the Brexit vote is also, in our eyes, not unrelated to the perception of rising inequality within countries, but also to the exposure to global inequality. So one's own position in the global income distribution might also affect relationship, how people vote. And indeed in different European countries, and we're actually currently pursuing work on this, including Thomas Piketty, on political response to rising inequality. And so this will be released in about a year. Now, with respect to Hong Kong, we're also currently working on that. And we have a Hong Kong researcher that will soon produce results on Hong Kong inequality. One limitation is linked to the data. We have data on wage inequality in Hong Kong. So we miss, for the moment, capital incomes, which indeed are an important part of the story. In terms of wage inequality, very preliminary results, but we will release this in a few weeks or months, show a similar evolution as in mainland China, but more to come very soon on with World. And finally, on productivity, there's this general idea that, in fact, you need inequality to be productive, basically. That's a kind of standard economic textbook theory. In fact, there's a lot of recent work in experimental behavioral economics which show basically the opposite. That is, high inequality leads to less productivity at work because of disincentives. It reduces the motivation to work. And you see this in very interesting, exciting experimental setups at the University of California in Berkeley. Just the fact of revealing to people their wages, they didn't know where they were in the wage distribution within their university, within their workplace. When they're exposed to this, this leads to demotivation of those that are below what they should be paid. You have very interesting examples of this in Switzerland or in India, in very different contexts or countries, where we actually are able to measure the impact of inequality on productivity, which I think is a very interesting area for further research also in economics.
Jiwoo, I think we are 10 minutes overdue our scheduled time. Perhaps you may want to make a few more comments and then wrap up the session.
I don't want to say anything else, but I just want to thank the two guest speakers coming from very far away, and you know, to give us this great intellectual food for thought. So we're really grateful for their coming, and also for your coming too. So in such a cold day in Hong Kong, coming such a long distance from Central and other places. So we really want to thank you for participating in this event. And then finally, let me also thank Casey for doing such a wonderful job. He did a lot of preparation work for this event, and so did Severin and Kelly and my colleagues, Yvonne and Beth and Graham, and did I miss anyone else? Our AGI staff is the greatest in Hong Kong. Okay, thank you for coming.